Picture this. You're standing on the sun-drenched cliffs of Capri, an island paradise off the coast of Italy, where azure waves crash against jagged rocks and the air smells of salt and wild herbs. It's the year 27 AD, and you've somehow been transported back to ancient Rome's golden age, or so it seems. But as you wander the winding paths toward a sprawling villa perched high above the sea, you hear muffled cries echoing from hidden grottos. Whispers among the servants speak of unspeakable horrors, young boys and girls vanishing into the emperor's private chambers, never to emerge the same. And at the centre of it all is Tiberius, the second emperor of Rome, a man who turned this idyllic retreat into a fortress of depravity, where absolute power twisted into something monstrous. What you're about to uncover isn't just a forgotten chapter of Roman history. It's a chilling testament to how isolation and unchecked authority can corrupt a soul, transforming a once respected leader into a tyrant who enslaved and tormented the innocent for his own twisted pleasures. Before we dive deeper into this dark truth, if you're as fascinated by these hidden horrors of the past as I am, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that peel back the layers of history. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. It's incredible how we're connecting across the globe to explore these ancient nightmares together. Now let's step back and understand the man behind the monster. Tiberius wasn't born a villain. In fact, his early life reads like the blueprint for a great Roman leader. Born in 42 BC to a noble family, he grew up in the shadow of Augustus, the first emperor, who adopted him as heir after a series of family tragedies left no other options. Tiberius was a soldier at heart, brave, disciplined, and victorious on the battlefield. He led legions through the brutal campaigns in Germany and Illyricum, earning the respect of his troops with his tactical genius and stoic demeanour. Romans saw him as the steady hand that would guide the empire after Augustus's death in 14 AD. When he ascended to the throne at age 55, many hoped for stability. He started strong, too, reforming the Praetorian Guard, stabilising the economy, and avoiding unnecessary wars. But beneath that facade of competence lurked a deep-seated resentment and paranoia. Tiberius had always felt like second choice. Augustus had preferred others, and the emperor's mother, Livia, was a manipulative force who pulled strings to secure his position. This bred insecurity in a man who craved control. By the mid-20s AD, the pressures of rule began to crack his resolve. Scandals rocked the imperial family. His son Drusus died under suspicious circumstances, possibly poisoned, and rumours swelled about treasonous plots from every corner. Tiberius grew increasingly withdrawn, distrusting the Senate and even his closest advisors. He saw enemies in the shadows of Rome's marble forums, where flattery masked ambition. The city that once revered him now felt like a cage. So, in 26 AD, at the age of 67, Tiberius made a decision that would forever alter his legacy. He abandoned Rome for the isolated beauty of Capri. This wasn't a simple retirement. It was an escape into exile, where he could rule from afar without the prying eyes of the capital. Capri, with its sheer cliffs and hidden coves, became his personal kingdom, a place where he could indulge whims without consequence. He built not one, but 12 lavish villas across the island, each named after a Roman god, like the Grand Villa Jovis dedicated to Jupiter. These weren't mere homes, they were fortresses of luxury and secrecy, connected by winding paths and guarded by loyal Praetorians. From the heights of Villa Jovis, Tiberius could gaze out over the Tyrrhenian Sea, plotting the empire's fate, while the world below remained oblivious to what unfolded behind those walls. But isolation has a way of festering the mind, doesn't it? Without the checks and balances of Roman society, Tiberius's darker impulses began to surface. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Tacitus paint a picture of a man who, freed from scrutiny, descended into paranoia and perversion. He surrounded himself with astrologers and sycophants, obsessing over omens and horoscopes to predict betrayals. Letters flew back to Rome, ordering executions for perceived slights. Senators dragged from their homes, forced to confess to fabricated crimes before being thrown from the Tarpeian Rock. This was the era of the infamous treason trials, where mere whispers could mean death. Tiberius's right-hand man, Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect, enforced this reign of terror from the capital, but the emperor pulled the strings from his island sanctuary. Yet it was on Capri itself where the true horrors unfolded. The island's remoteness allowed Tiberius to create a world entirely of his own design, populated not by willing companions, but by victims ensnared in his web. He began importing slaves, young boys and girls, carefully selected for their beauty and innocence, from across the empire. These weren't ordinary servants. They were playthings in a grotesque theatre of power. Suetonius describes how Tiberius trained them in elaborate sexual rituals, calling them his minnows or little fishes, who would swim around him in private pools, nibbling at his body in ways that defy decency. Imagine the terror of these children, ripped from their families in distant provinces, shipped to this beautiful yet foreboding island, only to be groomed for the emperor's fantasies. They had no escape. The cliffs were too steep, the guards too vigilant. Tiberius's villas were designed with hidden chambers and grottos, like the infamous Blue Grotto, where legends say he conducted his most depraved acts under the eerie glow of reflected light. But this wasn't mindless cruelty. It was calculated. Tiberius, ever the strategist, used these perversions as a shield against his inner demons. His paranoia extended to his pleasures. He feared poisoning or assassination even in intimacy. So he surrounded himself with the powerless, those who couldn't fight back. The enslaved victims became extensions of his will, their suffering a twisted form of control in a life where he felt increasingly powerless against fate. As the years dragged on, the island's reputation spread in hushed tones across the empire. Merchants and travellers brought back tales of screams echoing from the cliffs at night, of bodies occasionally washing up on the shores below, victims of the Caprine leap, a punishment where the condemned were hurled from the heights into the sea, their bodies battered on the rocks before drowning. Tiberius allegedly watched these executions from his villa, sipping wine as if it were entertainment. The psychological toll on the enslaved was unimaginable. Many were forced into roles that stripped them of humanity, dressed as mythological figures, compelled to perform in orgies that blurred the lines between pleasure and torture. Some sources claim he experimented with bizarre contraptions, devices meant to heighten sensation, but often resulting in agony. The children in particular suffered the most. Suetonius recounts how Tiberius sought out the youngest and most vulnerable, training them from infancy in his school of debauchery. Can you picture the fear in their eyes, the way they must have trembled as they were summoned to the emperor's chambers? These weren't abstract historical figures. They were real people, sons and daughters of farmers, artisans, and conquered peoples, whose lives were reduced to mere instruments of imperial whim. And yet Tiberius maintained a facade of normalcy. He corresponded with the Senate, issued edicts on grain supplies and provincial governance, all while his island paradise devolved into a hellscape. This duality is what makes his story so chilling. A man capable of rational rule by day, unleashing unspeakable evil by night. The enslaved victims had no voice, no recourse. Their stories survived only through the scandalized writings of later historians, who used them to vilify Tiberius as the epitome of tyrannical excess. But as we peel back these layers, we see not just a monster, but a product of Rome's corrupt system. A system that granted one man godlike power without accountability. The dark truth of Capri isn't just about the acts themselves. It's about how power, when isolated, breeds monstrosity. Tiberius's reign on the island lasted over a decade, until his death in 37 AD, at age 77. By then the empire was weary of his terror, and his successor, Caligula, would inherit both the throne and whispers of even greater madness. But the scars on Capri lingered, a reminder that beauty can hide the ugliest truths. As we delve deeper into this island of terror, let's focus on the heart of the darkness, the enslaved victims who populated Tiberius's twisted paradise. These weren't faceless masses. They were individuals, often children as young as 5 or 6, plucked from the empire's farthest reaches, Gaul, Hispania, even the exotic lands of Egypt and Syria. Imagine being a parent in some dusty provincial town, watching Roman soldiers arrive with imperial orders, selecting your child based on nothing more than a pretty face or delicate build. No explanations given, no appeals allowed. These kids were shipped across the Mediterranean, arriving on Capri's shores disoriented and terrified. Their old lives erased in an instant. Upon arrival, they were herded into the lower levels of the villas, where overseers, often eunuchs loyal to Tiberius, began their grim indoctrination. The emperor's tastes were specific and perverse. He favoured what the ancients called spintriae, young slaves trained in elaborate sexual games. Suetonius, in his Lives of the Caesars, describes scenes that make the stomach turn. Groups of these children linked in chains, forced to perform acts that mimicked mythological depravities, all under the watchful eye of the emperor and his select guests. Tiberius would recline on silken couches, surrounded by frescoes of gods and nymphs, directing the proceedings like a deranged playwright. The Minnows ritual was particularly infamous. Naked boys and girls swimming in heated pools, instructed to nibble and caress the aging emperor's body as he floated among them. It sounds almost whimsical until you consider the coercion, the beatings for hesitation, the drugs sometimes administered to ensure compliance. These acts weren't spontaneous. They were rehearsed, with tutors drilling the slaves in positions and responses designed to maximize Tiberius's pleasure while minimizing any risk to him. Paranoia infused every aspect. Even in ecstasy, he feared rebellion. So the children were kept malnourished and isolated, their spirits broken through systematic abuse. One can only imagine the psychological warfare. Promises of freedom dangled like bait, only to be snatched away. Or worse, pitting slaves against each other in competitions for the emperor's favour. Some sources whisper of even darker experiments, devices inspired by Greek myths like mechanical contraptions that inflicted pain disguised as pleasure, or forced participations in rituals that left permanent scars. The Blue Grotto, that natural wonder with its ethereal blue light, was allegedly one of his favourite spots for these encounters, the cave's echoes amplifying the cries that no one outside could hear. But let's not forget the girls, often overlooked in the histories, but no less victimised. Tiberius collected virgins, training them in what he called his secret arts, only to discard them once they aged or bored him. Many were married off to lowborn servants as a final humiliation, their bodies and minds forever marked by the island's secrets. The terror extended beyond the physical. It was a complete erasure of self. Slaves were renamed after gods or mythical figures. A boy might become Ganymede, the cupbearer of Zeus, forced to embody the role in every degrading way. Their days blurred into a nightmare routine, mornings spent in grooming and lessons, afternoons in service, nights in dread of the summons. Escape was a fantasy. The island's geography was its own prison. Sheer cliffs plunged hundreds of feet to the rocks below, patrolled by guards who shot arrows at anyone attempting to swim away. Those caught were subjected to the Caprine leap, a spectacle where the victim was flogged, then hurled off the precipice, their body crashing against the stones before the sea claimed them. Tiberius reportedly enjoyed these from his terrace, commenting on the grace of their fall as if critiquing a gladiatorial match. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Many lost the will to live, resorting to self-harm or starvation. Yet in this abyss, flickers of humanity persisted. Whispered alliances among the slaves, secret signals of solidarity, perhaps even small acts of sabotage that went unrecorded. Tiberius's guests added another layer of horror. He invited select senators and philosophers to Capri, not for counsel, but to witness and participate, binding them in complicity. Refusal meant exile or death, so they played along, their laughter masking revulsion. This created a culture of fear that permeated the island, servants spying on each other, reporting any dissent to curry favour. The emperor's astrologer, Thrasyllus, became a constant companion, interpreting stars to justify the madness, while physicians concocted potions to sustain Tiberius's vigour into old age. But as the years wore on, the depravity escalated. By the 30s AD, with Sejanus handling affairs in Rome, Tiberius felt untouchable. He expanded his collection, importing exotic slaves from beyond the empire's borders, dark-skinned beauties from Africa, fair-haired youths from the Germanic frontiers, treating them like rare artifacts in a private museum of flesh. Orgies grew more elaborate, incorporating animals, costumes, and even mock sacrifices that teetered on the edge of reality. Suetonius claims Tiberius had a special room, the Celleria, lined with erotic paintings and literature from Elephantis, where slaves were forced to reenact the most explicit scenes. The air in these chambers must have been thick with incense and sweat. The sounds a cacophony of forced moans and hidden sobs. For the victims, time lost meaning. A day could stretch into eternity, each moment a negotiation between survival and despair. Some adapted by dissociating, their minds fracturing under the strain, while others clung to memories of home, whispering prayers to forgotten gods. The island's natural beauty mocked their suffering. Blooming oleanders and crashing waves, a cruel backdrop to the villa's hidden atrocities. Tiberius, meanwhile, rationalized it all through his Stoic philosophy, twisted to suit his needs. He saw himself as above mortal laws, a living god experimenting with the boundaries of human experience. But cracks appeared even in his armour. Bouts of illness left him bedridden, during which his rages intensified, lashing out at the very slaves who nursed him. Rumours of his impotence fueled further cruelties, as he sought to prove his dominance through ever more inventive torments. The enslaved bore the brunt, their bodies repositories for his frustrations. Yet history records glimmers of resistance. A slave who poisoned a meal, only to be discovered and executed, or whispered plots that fizzled under surveillance. These acts, though futile, remind us that even in the depths of subjugation, the human spirit seeks light. As Tiberius's reign dragged toward its end, the island became a pressure cooker of secrets, with victims aging into broken adults or perishing young. The dark truth is that Capri wasn't just a retreat. It was a laboratory of human degradation, where one man's isolation birthed a legacy of suffering that echoed far beyond the waves. The victims' stories, though fragmented, demand we confront how power, unchecked, devours the innocent. The victims' stories, though fragmented, demand we confront how power, unchecked, devours the innocent. To fully grasp the scope of Tiberius's island of terror, we must turn our gaze beyond Capri's shores and examine how this isolated depravity rippled out to poison the entire Roman Empire. While the emperor indulged his perversions in seclusion, he didn't relinquish control of Rome. In fact, his absence amplified the fear that gripped the capital. Enter Lucius alias Sejanus, the ambitious praetorian prefect who became Tiberius's eyes, ears, and executioner on the mainland. Sejanus was no mere functionary. He was a master manipulator, rising from humble origins to command the elite guard that protected the emperor. With Tiberius ensconced on Capri, Sejanus seized the opportunity to consolidate the power, turning the praetorian barracks into a hub of intrigue and terror. He fed Tiberius's paranoia with carefully crafted reports of conspiracies, real or imagined, prompting a wave of treason trials that decimated the Roman elite. Senators, once the backbone of the Republic, found themselves accused on the flimsiest evidence. A stray word, a suspicious glance, or even a dream interpreted as disloyalty by the emperor's astrologers. Tiberius, from his cliffside villa, would review these accusations via courier, often sealing fates with a single scribbled note. The trials were spectacles of injustice. Defendants denied proper defence, witnesses coerced or fabricated, and verdicts predetermined. Many chose suicide over the humiliation, slashing their wrists in bathhouses or leaping from rooftops, their blood staining the marble streets of Rome. Sejanus orchestrated it all, eliminating rivals and amassing wealth, while Tiberius watched from afar, his island isolation allowing him to detach from the human cost. But Capri wasn't disconnected. It was the nerve centre. Messengers shuttled between the island and the capital, carrying edicts that sowed dread across the provinces. Tiberius's letters were laced with cryptic warnings, demanding loyalty oaths and purges that extended to governors and generals. The empire, vast and sprawling from Britain to Syria, felt the chill of his suspicion. In distant outposts, legions muttered about the old goat on Capri, a nickname that captured both his lechery and his tyrannical grip. Yet this remote rule enabled the very horrors on the island. Without the Senate's oversight, Tiberius could import slaves unchecked, their disappearances buried in bureaucratic obscurity. Sejanus played a dual role here, supplying fresh victims as gifts to curry favour, shipping them under the guise of imperial tribute. These connections wove a web of complicity. Senators who visited Capri to plead cases often witnessed the depravities firsthand, returning to Rome silenced by fear or blackmail. The island's terror thus became a tool of governance, a whispered threat that kept the elite in line. Displease the emperor, and you might find yourself summoned to those sunlit cliffs, never to return. As the 20s AD gave way to the 30s, the purges intensified. In 31 AD, Tiberius finally turned on Sejanus himself, uncovering, or fabricating, a plot by the prefect to usurp the throne. The downfall was swift and brutal. Sejanus was arrested, strangled, and his body dragged through the streets, torn apart by a vengeful mob. His family, including innocent children, were executed in a frenzy of retribution. Tiberius, safe on Capri, claimed divine insight for the discovery, but it only deepened his isolation. Now, without his enforcer, he relied on even more ruthless agents, like the infamous Macro, who continued the treason trials with renewed vigour. The empire bled talent and morale. Capable administrators fled into exile, while sycophants filled the voids, parroting the emperor's whims. Economically, the purges disrupted trade. Confiscated estates flooded the market with cheap land, but fear stifled investment. Provinces groaned under heavier taxes to fund Tiberius's lavish villas and imported luxuries, including the slaves that fueled his appetites. Back on Capri, these events only heightened the madness. With Sejanus gone, Tiberius's paranoia peaked, extending even to his household. Slaves who had served for years were suddenly suspected of poisoning or spying, subjected to torturous interrogations in hidden chambers. Imagine the atmosphere. Guards patrolling moonlit paths, eavesdropping on every conversation, while the emperor brooded in his opulent halls, surrounded by erotic art and trembling attendants. The enslaved victims, already broken, now faced arbitrary cruelties, whippings for imagined slights, or worse, being forced to participate in mock trials that mirrored the ones in Rome, with Tiberius playing judge, jury, and executioner. One chilling account from Tacitus describes how he had slaves thrown to the eels in his fish ponds, their screams entertaining guests as the creatures tore them apart. This blending of political terror and personal sadism created a feedback loop. The more Tiberius purged the empire, the more he retreated into his island fantasies, using the victims as outlets for his rage. The psychological strain on everyone involved was immense. For the slaves, it was a daily gamble: perform perfectly or face the leap. For the guards and staff, loyalty meant complicity in atrocities, eroding their souls. Even visitors from Rome, arriving by boat under the guise of state business, left changed, carrying tales that fueled underground resistance. Whispers of rebellion simmered in the legions, but Tiberius's network of spies quashed them before they ignited. The island's remoteness, once a sanctuary, became a symbol of imperial decay, beautiful from afar, rotten within. As Tiberius aged, his body failing from years of excess, the horrors took on a desperate edge. He turned to quack remedies and elixirs, experimenting on slaves to test their efficacy, often with fatal results. The villas, once gleaming with marble and gold, fell into a state of eerie neglect, overgrown with vines as if nature itself recoiled. Yet the emperor clung to power, naming heirs like Caligula and Gemellus, only to manipulate them from afar. The dark truth is that Capri's terror wasn't contained. It infected the empire, turning Rome's golden age into a prelude to further madness. Tiberius's rule from the island demonstrated how one man's isolation could orchestrate widespread suffering, linking the screams in hidden grottos to the executions in the Forum. The victims on Capri were but the most intimate casualties in a larger war against trust and humanity. As we approach the end of his reign, we see how this system of fear ultimately consumed its creator, leaving a legacy that historians would debate for centuries. As we approach the end of his reign, we see how this system of fear ultimately consumed its creator, leaving a legacy that historians would debate for centuries. By the mid-30s AD, Tiberius was a shadow of the soldier emperor who had once commanded legions with iron resolve. Age and excess had ravaged his body. Ulcers covered his skin, his once keen mind clouded by suspicion and the haze of constant indulgence. On Capri, the villas that had been playgrounds of depravity now echoed with the groans of an old man clinging to life. His days a monotonous cycle of astrological consultations, sparse meals laced with antidotes against imagined poisons, and sporadic bursts of rage directed at whoever was nearest. The enslaved victims, who had endured years of torment, now witnessed their tormentors decline. But it brought no relief, only heightened danger. As Tiberius weakened, his cruelties became more erratic, lashing out at slaves for the slightest perceived failure, perhaps seeing in their youthful vitality a mocking reminder of his own decay. One account from Suetonius describes how he would summon groups of boys and girls to his bedside, not for pleasure, but to berate them for hours, forcing them to recount fabricated treacheries, as if confessing their own. The psychological games intensified. He toyed with promises of manumission, only to revoke them, delighting in the despair that followed. For these victims, the emperor's frailty was a double-edged sword. His physical limitations might spare them some abuses, but his mental unravelling unleashed new terrors, like being confined in dark chambers for days without food, emerging broken and disoriented. The island's staff, too, walked on eggshells. Physicians who failed to alleviate his pains were accused of sorcery and tossed from the cliffs, their screams a grim symphony to his insomnia. Tiberius's heirs became pawns in this twilight drama. He had named his grandson Gemellus and his grandnephew Caligula as joint successors, but paranoia turned this into a deadly game. Caligula, summoned to Capri in 32 AD, navigated the minefield with cunning, flattering the old man while witnessing the horrors firsthand. Whispers suggest Caligula participated in the depravities, learning lessons in tyranny that would define his own infamous rule. Gemellus, younger and more innocent, fared worse. Tiberius viewed him with suspicion, eventually sidelining him. The enslaved watched these power struggles unfold, sometimes pressed into service as spies or distractions, their lives hanging on the whims of these imperial vipers. As death loomed, Tiberius's grip on reality slipped further. He obsessed over prophecies, consulting Thrasyllus daily, interpreting every comet or bird flight as a sign of betrayal. In 37 AD, his health collapsed during a rare trip to the mainland, forcing a hasty return to Capri. Bedridden in Villa Jovis, he alternated between lucidity and delirium, issuing contradictory orders that sowed chaos in Rome. Macro, the new praetorian prefect, sensing the end, began manoeuvring for Caligula's ascension. The final days were a farce of imperial pretense. Tiberius, too weak to rise, insisted on being carried about the villa, inspecting his minnows one last time, his rheumy eyes gleaming with faded lust. On March 16, 37 AD, the end came. Accounts vary. Some say he succumbed to illness, others that Macro smothered him with pillows to hasten Caligula's rise. Suetonius adds a dramatic flourish, claiming Tiberius briefly revived after being pronounced dead, only to be finished off in panic. Whatever the truth, his passing unleashed a torrent of relief across the empire. Crowds in Rome chanted, "To the Tiber with Tiberius," echoing the fate of criminals whose bodies were dragged to the river. But on Capri, the immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of uncertainty for the victims. Caligula, now emperor, arrived to claim his inheritance, and with him came a brief illusion of change. He ordered the release of some political prisoners and publicly decried his predecessor's excesses, but the island's dark underbelly persisted. Many slaves were simply reassigned, their traumas unacknowledged, while others were sold off or executed to erase evidence of the scandals. Caligula himself would soon descend into similar madness, allegedly drawing inspiration from Tiberius's playbook, turning Capri into a stage for his own bizarre whims. The villas stood as silent witnesses, their hidden chambers gradually falling into disrepair, but the scars on the survivors ran deep. Those who escaped, perhaps through manumission or flight, carried stories that seeped into the historical record, albeit filtered through bias and sensationalism. For the enslaved, freedom, if it came, was bittersweet. Many struggled to reintegrate, haunted by nightmares of the grottos and leaps. Some found solace in quiet lives, raising families far from Rome's shadow, while others succumbed to despair, their ends unrecorded. The empire, meanwhile, grappled with Tiberius's legacy. His death marked the end of an era, but the systems he perfected, remote rule, treason trials, unchecked imperial power, endured, paving the way for tyrants like Caligula and Nero. Historians like Tacitus, writing decades later, portrayed him as a hypocritical monster, using his story to critique the Principate's flaws. Suetonius amplified the salacious details, turning Capri into a byword for decadence. But these accounts, while vivid, often serve political agendas, exaggerating to vilify the Julio-Claudian line. Modern scholars debate the veracity: were the horrors real, or propaganda to justify later regimes? Archaeological evidence from Capri supports some claims. Ruins of Villa Jovis reveal opulent baths, secret passages, and precipitous drops matching the Caprine Leap descriptions. Yet, the victims remain voiceless, their perspectives lost to time. As we reflect on this final chapter, we see how Tiberius's end was poetic justice, consumed by the fear he inflicted, dying alone in the paradise he corrupted. His island of terror didn't die with him. It lived on in the empire's collective memory, a cautionary tale of power's isolating poison. The enslaved, though broken, embodied resilience, their survival a quiet rebellion against the machine that sought to erase them. In uncovering these truths, we honour their suffering, reminding ourselves that history's darkest corners demand illumination, lest they repeat. In uncovering these truths, we honour their suffering, reminding ourselves that history's darkest corners demand illumination, lest they repeat. To truly understand the enduring shadow of Tiberius's island of terror, we must explore the psychological depths that drove a man from disciplined leader to depraved tyrant, and how his actions reflect broader patterns of power's corruption throughout history. Tiberius's transformation wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion, rooted in a lifetime of suppressed resentments and the intoxicating isolation of absolute authority. Born into the cutthroat world of Augustan Rome, he was moulded by a mother, Livia, whose ambitions overshadowed his own desires, and an adoptive father who viewed him as a reluctant necessity. This bred a profound insecurity, masked by stoic facade. On the battlefield, he was unflinching. But in private, doubts festered. When he became emperor, the weight of the purple cloak amplified these cracks. Every sycophantic bow reminded him of his perceived inadequacies. Every plot rumour a validation of his fears. Capri offered escape, but it also removed the last tethers to reality. Psychologically, isolation is a breeding ground for madness. Modern studies on solitary confinement show how it warps perception, heightening paranoia and distorting empathy. For Tiberius, the island's cliffs became metaphorical walls, enclosing him in an echo chamber where his whims became law. Without the Senate's debates or the populace's gaze, his inhibitions dissolved, allowing repressed urges to surface. Ancient sources hint at childhood traumas, perhaps abuse or neglect, that manifested in his adult perversions, a cycle where he inflicted on others the powerlessness he once felt. The enslaved victims were proxies in this internal war, their innocence a canvas for his rage against fate. Consider the mindset required to orchestrate such systematic abuse. Tiberius didn't just indulge, he ritualized it, creating elaborate scenarios that gave him godlike control over life and pleasure. The minnows weren't random. They were a deliberate regression to infantile fantasies, swimming in pools as if recreating a womb-like security he never knew. His paranoia intertwined with this, fearing even these powerless children might turn against him, leading to constant surveillance and purges within his own household. This created a toxic environment where trust evaporated, and every interaction was laced with suspicion. The victims, caught in this web, developed coping mechanisms that speak to human resilience. Some dissociated, retreating into mental fortresses, while others formed covert bonds, sharing stolen moments of comfort amid the horror. But the toll was irreversible. Survivors often carried lifelong traumas, manifesting in what we'd now recognise as PTSD, nightmares, aversion to touch, an inability to form relationship. Tiberius's story parallels other historical tyrants who retreated into isolation, their depravities escalating unchecked. Think of Ivan the Terrible in his fortified palaces, or more recently, dictators like Saddam Hussein in his bunkers. Power without accountability breeds monstrosity. In Rome's context, Tiberius set a precedent for the Julio-Claudians. Caligula, who spent formative years on Capri, amplified the madness, declaring himself a god and engaging in similar excesses. Nero, as we've explored in other tales, twisted grief into obsession. This pattern reveals a systemic flaw in the empire. The Principate, disguised as a republic, concentrated divine power in flawed humans, inviting abuse. Archaeological digs on Capri bolster these psychological insights. Excavations at Villa Jovis uncover not just grandeur, mosaic floors, frescoed walls depicting erotic myths, but evidence of secrecy. Narrow tunnels leading to private baths, overlooks perfect for witnessing leaps, and remnants of fish ponds that match Suetonius's descriptions. Coins and inscriptions from the era show Tiberius's face stamped with divine attributes, a visual echo of his self-deification. Yet these ruins also humanize the victims. Scattered artifacts like children's toys or broken shackles whisper of lives interrupted. Modern forensics suggests some skeletal remains from nearby sites bear signs of malnutrition and trauma, corroborating the accounts. Historians debate the extent Tacitus, writing under the Flavians, may have exaggerated to legitimize their rule, portraying Tiberius as a foil to better emperors. Suetonius, with his gossip-laden style, focused on scandal to entertain, but kernels of truth persist across sources. Psychological analyses today frame Tiberius as a narcissist with sadistic traits, his isolation exacerbating antisocial behaviours. The island's natural features played a role. 2. The constant sea winds, the vertiginous heights, perhaps fueling his god complex, as if he ruled from Olympus itself. For the enslaved, this environment was a sensory assault. The salt air mingling with incense and blood, the relentless sun contrasting the dark grottos. Their exploitation wasn't just physical, it was a profound violation of identity, forcing them into roles that erased cultural and personal histories. A boy from Gaul might be renamed Apollo, stripped of his native tongue, compelled to embody Roman myths. This cultural erasure mirrored the empire's broader conquests, where subjugated peoples were commodified. Tiberius's Capri thus became a microcosm of imperial Rome, beautiful, powerful, yet built on suffering. As we peel back these layers, we see how his psychological unravelling wasn't inevitable, but enabled by a system that deified emperors. The victim's endurance offers a counter-narrative. In the face of dehumanization, small acts of defiance, a hidden glance of solidarity, a whispered story passed down, preserved sparks of humanity. Today, Capri is a tourist haven, its ruins drawing visitors who snap photos of Villa Jovis without grasping the blood soaked into the stones. But informed exploration reveals the site's duality, paths once trod by terrified children, now strolled by vacationers. This contrast underscores the importance of remembering. By confronting these truths, we prevent history's repetition in modern forms of isolation and abuse, from solitary confinement in prisons to the unchecked power of leaders behind closed doors. Tiberius's legacy warns that power, when secluded, devours not just victims but the powerful themselves, leaving empires teetering on the edge of chaos. Tiberius's legacy warns that power, when secluded, devours not just victims but the powerful themselves, leaving empires teetering on the edge of chaos. As we reach the culmination of this dark journey through Capri's shadowed history, it's time to step back and reflect on the broader echoes of Tiberius's reign, how one man's island of terror became a timeless symbol of imperial rot, influencing not just the fall of Rome but the very way we understand tyranny today. The emperor's death in 37 AD didn't erase the stains. If anything, it immortalized them, embedding Capri in the annals of infamy. Caligula, his successor, inherited the villas and arguably the madness, transforming the island into a stage for his own spectacles of excess, from incestuous parties to declaring war on the sea itself. But where Tiberius was calculating in his cruelties, Caligula was flamboyant, amplifying the horrors until his assassination 4 years later. This chain reaction continued through the Julio-Claudian dynasty, with each emperor building on the precedents of isolation and unchecked power, culminating in Nero's fiery downfall and the year of the 4 emperors. Rome's stability cracked under this weight, the Principate revealing its fatal flaw. A system designed for gods but occupied by men. Tiberius's Capri set the template, proving that remote rule bred suspicion, and suspicion bred slaughter. The enslaved victims of the island, though their individual names are lost to us, represent the countless unnamed casualties of empire, people whose suffering propped up the grandeur we still admire in ruins and artifacts. Their stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths: the Colosseum's games, the aqueduct's engineering, the roads that spanned continents, all built on the backs of the subjugated, often at costs as horrific as those on Capri. In piecing together their fates, we glimpse a human cost that textbooks often gloss over, reminding us that history isn't just dates and battles, it's the quiet agonies of the forgotten. Imagine, if you will, one such victim, a young girl from a Thracian village, wide-eyed on the boat to Capri, dreaming of adventure, only to find herself in a gilded cage. Her days filled with forced performances, her nights with dread, until perhaps she was discarded, married off to a guard, or simply vanished over the cliffs. Did she ever escape? Did she whisper her tale to a sympathetic ear, planting seeds of the scandals that reached historians? These questions haunt us, underscoring the resilience required to survive such erasure. Tiberius's influence extended far beyond his lifetime, shaping literature and law. Dante placed him in the Inferno's circles of fraud, while Shakespeare drew on Roman tyrants for characters like Macbeth, whose isolated paranoia mirrors the emperor's. In modern times, Capri's story has inspired novels, films, and even psychological studies. Think of how isolation themes in works like The Shining echo the island's descent into madness. Politically, parallels abound. Dictators from Stalin in his dachas to modern autocrats in fortified compounds ruling through fear while indulging private vices. The treason trials of Tiberius foreshadow purges in totalitarian regimes where whispers lead to gulags or disappearances. Even in democracies, the allure of secluded power, presidential retreats, corporate enclaves warns of similar pitfalls where accountability fades and abuses flourish. By studying Capri, we gain tools to recognize these patterns, advocating for transparency and checks that prevent history's repetition. Archaeologically, the island yields ongoing revelations. Recent digs uncover slave quarters beneath Villa Jovis, with graffiti scratches that might be desperate messages, names, pleas, or curses against the emperor. These findings humanize the narrative, bridging ancient suffering to our empathy. Tourism on Capri today juxtaposes this grim past with luxury. Visitors sip cocktails where slaves once trembled, a stark reminder of how time sanitizes horror. But informed travelers, armed with knowledge, can honor the victims by acknowledging the blood beneath the beauty, turning vacations into pilgrimages of remembrance. Psychologically, Tiberius's case study fascinates experts. Was he a product of nurture, warped by Livia's machinations and Augustus's indifference, or nature, inherently predisposed to sadism? His stoicism, twisted into justification for cruelty, shows how philosophies can mask monstrosity. For the victims, trauma theories suggest generational impacts, survivors passing down invisible wounds, shaping family lines long after the empire fell. This ripple effect extends to Rome's decline. The moral decay, Tiberius exemplified eroded public trust, contributing to the barbaric invasions and the Western Empire's collapse in 476 AD. Yet in this darkness, there's a spark of hope. The very fact that these stories survived through biased historians and oral traditions testifies to humanity's drive to expose truth. The enslaved, voiceless in life, speak through the ages, demanding justice in retrospect. As we conclude this exploration, let's remember that Capri wasn't just Tiberius's playground. It was a crucible where power's ugliest facets were forged. The island's azure waters, once witnesses to leaps of despair, now lap peacefully, but their depths hold secrets that challenge us to look beyond surface beauty. In sharing this tale, we pay tribute to the victims, the boys and girls who endured the unimaginable, their spirits unbroken even in subjugation. Their legacy isn't one of defeat, but of warning. Absolute power, especially in isolation, corrupts absolutely, twisting love into obsession, governance into terror, and humans into monsters or martyrs. If this story has chilled you, moved you, or sparked a hunger for more hidden histories, remember to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts. Perhaps share a parallel from your own cultural history. Together, from every corner of the world, we're illuminating these shadows, ensuring the past's lessons guide our future. The dark truth of Tiberius's island endures, a haunting reminder that behind every empire's glory lie stories of suffering that deserve to be heard, honoured, and never forgotten.